Kia ora tātou, good evening, and well, thank you very much for coming along. I mean, this would be a perfect evening for a nice stroll in Cornwall Park or up One Tree Hill or something, so it's very nice of you to come indoors on such a lovely evening. The sort of broad plan I have is that I want to talk about cities and God in cities. So I'm going to talk about, and start by talking about cities themselves, why they are wonderful and why they're horrible, but also why they're important, but getting hugely more important, and the rate of urbanisation is accelerating. And Auckland is actually very much up with that, not quite at the top of the ranks of fast-growing cities, but if Auckland had been a US city during the 2000s, we would have actually been the 5th fastest growing US city. So, and we don't think of ourselves that way. So having sort of made that case about cities, I'll then say very briefly, this isn't going to work if we keep building cities the way we do. And so as a very straightforward way of trying to think about the sustainability of cities and the wealth of cities, I'm just going to talk about 4 of the 4 core strands of sustainability about the culture of cities, the society and structure of them, the nature, the environment, the ecosystem, and then the economy of them. And at each of those 4, I'll pose the question, well, what use is God in this? We'll then take a little break, and I'm going to set you a little task during the break, which is to think about why do you live in Auckland as opposed to somewhere else? What attracts you or repels you about Auckland? And then there's another really interesting question, but I'll save that till we get to the break. And then after the break, we'll just come back and discuss what is it about Auckland that we like and enjoy, or fear, or loathe. And then go back to those 4 strands of sustainability and ask, or I'll attempt to offer some thoughts on where God is in the culture, in society, in nature, in our cities, and in the economics of that. And then draw those themes together. This is based on a lecture I was very kindly invited to do last year at the School of Theology on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the starting, isn't this really strange, Auckland University only started teaching theology 10 years ago. Before that it was in the colleges like St John's. And so this is adapted from that, but that wasn't illustrated. This is lavishly illustrated, because Richard set such a high bar last week. And running through this are a couple of very big questions. Can we create a city of God, or is that a dangerous delusion or illusion? Or some sense of God in the city, is that an urban imperative? Do we actually really need to find God in the city if we're going to create wonderful cities? Anyway, that's where I'm going to go. And that was such a long preamble, my mini iPad already shut down. Cities are the dominant form of human organisation, and where they benefit societies, they can also hugely strain people and nature. And these ills about society will only escalate as human population grows and becomes even more urbanised. So to cope, we'll have to achieve a scale and a complexity and a speed of change that humankind's never managed before. This speed and scale and complexity of change dwarfs anything we've ever achieved before. And to do that, we'll have to work together, both within cities and between cities. And if we can't do that, I reckon we're doomed. But that's my most negative thought of the night. So we need all the help we can get with our cities. Now, particularly on relationships in cities. Now, handily, relationships are something that God's been good at for a long time, for approximately 13.8 billion years since Big Bang. That obviously isn't a picture of Big Bang because there was, by definition, nobody was around to take a picture of it. So if very broadly God and Big Bang is something about all this, then Jesus comes to the piece rather late, only about 2,000 years ago, to offer us some insight about those relationships at a very human level. And in fact, Jesus is kind of like just this afternoon, because 2,000 years ago is only 1/7 billionth of the history of the universe. So Jesus is like now in this big context. We began living in cities a long time ago, and it was around 450 BC that Babylon was the first city to reach 200,000 people. Though I imagine not everybody had a hanging garden, because even then inequality was a very salient feature of cities. But cities in their current form are actually quite new. They've grown very rapidly since the dawn of industrialization, around about 1750, because it was industrialization that enabled cities to generate hugely for good, so producing the likes of learning and science and innovation, material wealth, education, sanitation. Actually, sanitation's probably been the biggest thing. Clean water and deft dealing with sewage and other such benefits for mass populations. Now, here are two perspectives on the power of cities. And the first one is from Lewis Mumford, who is a US social philosopher. And this is what he wrote in his 1938 book, The Culture of Cities. The city is a fact of nature, like a cave, a run of mackerel, or an ant-heap. But it is also a conscious work of art and holds within its communal framework many simpler and more personal forms of art. Mind takes form in the city, and in turn, urban form conditions mind. The second perspective is from my favourite urbanist, Charles Landry, and this is from his 2006 book, The Art of City Making. At its best, good city making leads to the highest achievements of human culture. A cursory look at the globe reveals the names of cities old and new. Their names resonate as we think simultaneously of their physical presence, their activities, their cultures, and their people and ideas. Cairo, Isfahan, Delhi, Rome, Constantinople, Canton Guangzhou, Kyoto, New York, and a few pictures over the years I've taken in New York. San Francisco, Shanghai, Vancouver, or on a smaller scale, Bern, Florence, Varanasi, Shimban. Our best cities are the most elaborate and sophisticated artifacts humans have conceived, shaped and made. The worst are forgettable, damaging, destructive, even hellish. That's the World Trade Center. As Landry states, cities also generate huge ills when inequity and injustice, the exploitation of people and nature, create hellish cities or parts thereof. It was a great pleasure that a couple of years ago, Auckland's council invited Landry to work for a couple of days with local boards here in Auckland, and it was a great privilege to be involved in that work with him. He was very inspiring. And lastly, here's a view of modern life in general from Charles Taylor in his 1991 book, The Malaise of Modernity. The malaise, he wrote, is largely the result of individualism. In its debased form, individualism comes with a centering of the self, which both flattens and narrows our lives. Incidentally, the word idiot comes from the ancient Greek meaning self-centered, private, separate, and only concerned with self-interest rather than public or common good. I kind of like that definition of an idiot. Incidentally, also, the Greeks called people living beyond the pale, outside their cultured, worldly-wide cities, the Rubes and the Styx, they call them pagans. So combined with these, strongly suggests that God is very much a smart city dweller, like many other people who gravitate towards cities. In our short history of urban life to date, 2008 was a momentous year. Such was the acceleration of migration to cities. It was the year the United Nations declared that 50% of humans lived in cities for the first time, outnumbering their country cousins. Knowing this was going to happen in 2008, the Tate Modern Gallery in London put on a fabulous exhibition for 6 months in 2007, and it was a great privilege to be there, to visit. Here's some of the pictures I took. So, for example, these are models of cities by population density. So the higher the peak there, the more dense the population is. Well, you can see how flat London is, even though we think of London as a pretty dense city. But that's what Cairo looks like by comparison. And this is Mumbai, south of the main railway station, the scene of Slumdog Millionaires. It's kind of the pinnacle of that. And since 1900, between 1900 and 2007, Mumbai had grown by 1,180%. The exhibition posed some terrifically good questions, such as, can cities be improved by design? And can cities promote social justice and greater equality? This was a particularly interesting picture because this is a slice of São Paulo, Brazil. So this is one of the poorest favelas, one of the poorest slums. But this is how people live next door with their own individual hanging gardens of Babylon and some rather nice common grounds alongside. This is how the middle class live in São Paulo. Remarkably, each of those windows is a middle class apartment. And then that's just Los Angeles. Sorry, I don't mean just Los Angeles, but you get the picture. By the end of 2008, 6.8 billion people lived on the planet, thus 3.4 in cities. By 2030, the United Nations forecasts 5 billion people will live in cities. So in other words, over the next 18 years, urban populations in the world will rise by 50%. Now, clearly, China's one of the big movers. Some 20 million of its people shift to cities every year. So this means that the Chinese have to build lots of houses, roads, sewers, schools, factories, parks, airports, and all the other necessities and paraphernalia of urban life. And it's at quite a rate. So picture, by contrast, Auckland. So this was a lovely painting done shortly after Ngāti Whātua deeded the inferior bays up the harbour to the Pakeha and kept the good bays to themselves, quite rightly. And at that time, in 1840, September the 19th, 1840 being the day the land was gifted and Auckland declared, the whole Auckland region had about 20,000 people living in it, almost entirely Maori. Only a little cultivation, vast swathes of untouched bush, plentiful fishing grounds and beaches, and a plethora of pristine streams and rivers. And that's what Judges Bay looked like pretty much at the same time. So picture Auckland today, 173 years later. Auckland's now home to 1.5 million people. When Lynn, Celeste and I arrived in 1997, the population had only just gone over 1 million. So in the 16 years, it's more like about 17, 18 years, Auckland's increased by 50% in terms of population at that time. And so this is a massive urban landscape stretching about 50 kilometres north-south and about 40 kilometres east-west. Yet, such is the speed of urban migration in China, this is the greatest mass movement of people the world's ever seen, China is building the equivalent of one Auckland every 4 weeks. Of course, you can't do that, it's disaggregated around the whole country of China. But China is only a fraction of the story. Oh, by the way, that's the People's Square in Shanghai during and after the recent smog. So that's what it looks like without smog and with smog. But China's only a fraction of the story. Worldwide, the equivalent of 60 Aucklands are being built every year. So that's one Auckland every 6 days, and the rate is accelerating. By about 2050, up to 80% of the world's population, about 8 billion people out of 10 billion, will live in cities, almost 2.5 times the number today. And some places in Southeast Asia will be even far denser than that. And in fact, South America will probably become the most dense, where about 9 out of 10 people will be living in cities. A couple of years ago, the UN published a study of the mega-urban regions of the world, and the largest was Hong Kong, which is this tiny little bit just down here, and all the way through up to Guangzhou, the old Canton, and beyond in the Pearl River estuary. About 120 million people live across that region, and many more such regions are developing very fast. Our home city, of course, is small and spacious by comparison. Among the world's cities, Auckland ranks only 250th. A cat's just walked in at the back, which is quite marvellous. I think that's lucky. Oh, it's left. Sorry. I'll take that as lucky. 250 by population, and we're very undense. We only rank about 60th in terms of density of population. So, in fact, in Auckland we are less dense than Los Angeles. So if you think Los Angeles is urban sprawl, actually Auckland is more sprawled than Los Angeles. And at the top of the polls is Chennai in India, where the population is 10 times as dense, sorry, physically, not intellectually, as Auckland. So 27,000 people live in every square kilometre. But Auckland is not immune to these trends. Our population is expected to grow by 35% over the next 18 years, and by 2040 we could be a 3 million people city. So we're not that far off the general global pace of growth. And of course, our urban growth in recent decades has degraded our environment. We're also the 6th most immigrant-intensive city in the world. About 40% of us who live in Auckland were not born in New Zealand. Not born in Auckland, but not born in New Zealand. So, as I say, we're the 6th immigrant most intensive. We speak, according to the census, about 120 languages. We express about 150 ethnicities, and we profess every religion. We're one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the world, but I don't think we think of ourselves that way. Incidentally, while as a nation we pride ourselves and define ourselves largely by our rural and wild parts, in fact we're one of the most urbanised countries in the world. We are more urbanised than France and Germany, but we don't plan and build as if we were such a fast-growing urban society. So we can turn Auckland into a hellhole, that'd be quite easy to do, or we could take the opportunity to make Auckland a shining example of urbanism, albeit on a modest scale in world terms, but in a very New Zealand kind of way, a Kiwi expression of urbanism. To achieve a truly sustainable urban lifestyle in all 4 senses of that word: cultural, social, ecological and economic. As for culture, we city dwellers here and in New Zealand around the world are finding all 4 aspects of sustainability extremely challenging, and I would suggest that in a sense culturally is the most important, because if you don't get the culture right, you then can't develop society in a functional way, and therefore you can't deal with the issues like transport or environment. So for me, culture's top of the list. So today, as down through history, cultures that are strong, positive, open and adaptive thrive. Those that are weak, negative, closed and stagnant ultimately fail. That's kind of history. Given the speed and scale of change in the world, cultures have to adapt far faster than ever before. And one of the things I hugely enjoy about Auckland, because I'm around the city in all sorts of ways because of my work, I come across all sorts of workplaces which are just packed with immigrants, like a company like Raycon, where its workforce is a mini United Nations of people with advanced degrees, who very quickly acculturate into the very good company culture at Raycon, but also very quickly acculturate into Auckland in New Zealand, bringing their own expression to that as well. Clearly our cultures, though, urgently need help to adapt more effectively, so we need to find strength and identity, collaboration and caring, purpose and achievement. So the first question I put to God about cities is, can you help us achieve cultural wealth in our city? The next question is about society. If you get the culture right, then I believe you could start to develop a very good society, a very functional society. And for this purposes of this talk, I'm only going to define society very broadly as the way people organise themselves to give expression to their culture and to meet their needs. So if they organise well, society will thrive, and if they don't, it'll fail. Again, urban rather than rural societies are facing the greatest pressures on this and have the greatest opportunities, though, to change. This is a very negative view on urban societies, as the counterpoint to this from a German historian, Oswald Spengler. He wrote this back in 1918 in his book entitled The Decline of the West. In a place of a world, there is a city, a point, in which the whole life of broad regions is collecting while the rest dries up. In place of a tight, true people, born and grown of the soil, there is a new sort of nomad, cohering unstably in fluid masses, the parasitical city dweller. Traditionless, utterly matter-of-fact, religionless, clever, unfruitful, deeply contemptuous of the countryman, and especially the highest form of countryman, the country gentleman. But urban societies also deliver a lot. So the United Nations research shows that the world's 40 mega-regions cover only a tiny fraction of the Earth's surface, but they account for 18% of population, 66% of economic activity, and 85% of science and innovation. And it's the largest cities in all those countries that have the lion's share of all that activity, as indeed is the case in Auckland. But of course, cities don't live in splendid isolation. They live in symbiosis with the country around them and with global systems. That's why this sense of connectivity, of sustainability at a global level is very important. And that's why at Rio in June of last year, where the United Nations held its Rio Plus 20 Sustainability Summit, 20 years on from the first Rio one, was a very important time to re-energise the very big commitments that had been made 20 years before. But in fact, these people, the world leaders, John Key was one of the few heads of state who didn't go. Amy Adams, our environment minister, went instead, and looking fondly off to the right. And they signed a 283-paragraph final statement, which they laboured mightily produce. But if you analyse that statement, 99 times they said we support various actions, 50 times they said we encourage, and so feeble was their resolve they declared only 5 times that we will, and 3 times we must. In other words, faced with all these global issues, they could only come up with 3 times saying we must. It was the longest suicide note in history, tweeted Kumi Naidoo of Greenpeace International in one of the great all-time tweets, I think. Needless to say, there were protests on the streets of Rio, but Rio was remarkable, it was a huge privilege to be there, for a very positive reason, because in the absence of governments being able to move on these issues, it was civil society that filled the gap. Cities, towns, communities, NGOs, companies, tribes, and all manner of other society, officially part of the summit, produced a cornucopia of ambitious voluntary programs and initiatives and goals to help on the road to sustainability. Here's just a few people from the New Zealand delegation, and some of the best leaders from Generation Zero in New Zealand were there in that delegation. So it was a wonderful expression of community, and in this world where the issues that we're dealing with are increasingly global, the solutions are actually increasingly local. We need to fix them locally as long as those then aggregate up to meet those bigger global needs. But this requires strong learning communities that have a real common sense, a common understanding of what the issues are, a real common purpose, they know what they're going to do about it, and that achieves real commonwealth and benefits widely shared. And that's communities where individuals are valued and helped and encouraged so that they too can contribute, so we can move along a great deal faster. What was clear in Rio, and has become ever more clear since, is that a new kind of democracy is emerging through this, which is people-led, not politician-led. And it's locally driven, not centrally controlled. And it's interactive, not authoritarian. It's creative, not restrictive. It's networked, not hierarchical. And it's very much about learning, not stagnating. So my second question to God then is, can you help us empower people so that we can achieve social justice in our cities? The third strand of sustainability is obviously around nature itself. And cities really struggle sometimes to get the resources they need. They are absolutely voracious, so they account for a large chunk of the world's construction and building materials and energy and water and the like. So if this is going to work, we're going to have to learn to design, construct and run very, very different built environments. Food is a real challenge here, and cities only began to develop in late medieval times once rural communities could grow and store more than they need to sell the surplus to the cities, and thus allow specialist trades to develop in the cities. But what we'll see in the future is cities become a lot more self-sufficient. So for example, at Columbia University, there is a very deep expertise in vertical farming, i.e. farming up the sides of buildings. And this is one of their conceptions for Roosevelt Island in the East River of Manhattan, just off the Chrysler Building. And this is edible meat grown from stem cells. This is Dutch work. That's the meat growing. This is what it looks like when you turn it into a patty. And this was the hamburger that was made from that earlier on this year. It was a 250-pound hamburger. And that's not weight, that's currency. So that was a $500,000 hamburger. That's how expensive the meat was. But in due course, we could expect it to become far more economical. So are we ready to eat meat that is grown in a laboratory rather than laboriously grown on a farm, and you kill the animal just to get a few tender cuts of that meat? So this is kind of where the world's going. And given the intensifying issues around energy, buildings become living buildings where they generate all their own energy and recycle all their oan water. So this is a wonderful building at the Omega Center for Sustainable Living up at Rhinebeck, New York. Lynn once did a course there a number of years back. So there's a paradox in all this. The more urban our societies become, the more we'll have to emulate nature in the way we handle this and develop technologies and economics and the rest to make that work. Because that's the only way 10 billion people can live well on the planet, of which about 7 or 8 billion will be in cities. So my third question about God is, can you help us restore our relationship with nature in the cities? It's very easy to go to somewhere wonderful, wild on the west coast of Auckland and see God in the beauty and the magnificence of that. It's the question of can we find God in the wonder and beauty of our cities? The last one is economic. That's very clearly a big thing to do because clearly economic systems substantially disadvantage lots of people. Now, if this was an economic talk, I would delve into all sorts of thoughts on that. But I'm going to gloss over that by suggesting that if we got culture and society right, and we locked on to those trends around sustainability, a lot of the economic part of this would come right. So I'm just going to broadly say at this point, on that fourth question is, can God help us create economic equity in our city? I believe God can. City of God. So far I've outlined the case for radical change in cities and about right relationships between people and nature, and between people, nature and God. Now, Augustine wrote a monumental work, The City of God, 1500 years ago. I tried to read it last year with some help of academics at the University of Auckland who pointed me in the right direction of the highlights, and I still struggle terribly. But one big idea came out of it for me was that is the idea of a city of God, I like a really godlike place on earth, possible? And I think that's a very dangerous delusion, and I'm going to and why I'm going to suggest a different approach rather than a city of God. Back in Christmas a couple of years ago, Lynn gave me this wonderful biography of Jerusalem, written by a British Jewish historian, Simon Sebag Montefiore, and it chronicles 5,000 years of history of the city. Has anybody read the book? It's such a great book. But this is one of the many wonderful things he writes. Jerusalem is the holy city, yet it has always been a den of superstition, charlatanism and bigotry, the desire and prize of empires, yet of no strategic value. The cosmopolitan home of many sects, each of which believes the city belongs to them alone. A city of many names, yet each tradition is so sectarian it excludes any other. This is a place of such delicacy. It is described in Jewish sacred literature as feminine, always a sensual, living woman, always a beauty, but sometimes a shameless harlot, sometimes a wounded princess whose lovers have forsaken her. Jerusalem is the house of one God, the capital of two peoples, the temple of three religions, and she is the only city to exist twice, in heaven and on earth. The peerless grace of the terrestrial is as nothing to the glories of the celestial. The very fact that Jerusalem is both terrestrial and celestial means that the city can exist anywhere. New Jerusalems have been found all over the world, and everyone has their own version of Jerusalem. I was astonished by many things in the book, but not the least of which of how many people have died as a result of the city. I wished I had started a spreadsheet on page 1 to keep count. And the point is that I'm making here is that a city of God seems to me a very, very dangerous proposition, because this is supposed to be a thin place where heaven and earth are closer together, where the divine and human seem much more in touch, where matter melds, where God's presence is strongly felt, and where the veil between heaven and earth is lifted. And yes, there is something of that about Jerusalem, but it is very clear how easy it is for that to be immensely damaging. But could we turn it around the other way and think about a city of God where God is in a very much a human city? And how important would that be to the cities? So this is Marseille. And of all the French cities, it has the largest Muslim population, 240,000 of them out of 839,000 citizens. It has Jewish, Orthodox Christians, about 80,000 each, and it has about 250,000 Catholics of varying degrees of conviction. Yet it remains, sorry, that's unnecessary jibe. I'm sure some of the Anglicans are equally not sure. Yet it remained calm and civil in the summer of 2005 while other French cities erupted in violence. And you can find other very, very multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-faith cities around the world that are like that. And those cities are sane oases in a rabid world, according to Carl Mayer and Shireen Blair Brazak, a couple of American academics, and a book they published last year called Pax Ethnica. And they travelled the world trying to find out what made these cities work. And for example, one of the cases they offered was the borough of Queens, part of New York City, home to 2.3 million people, like us, speak many languages. Mayor and Bryzak said it was a crucible of creative diversity. But this was achieved by booming civic associations. It was the local library giving advice on learning English, about sorting out healthcare, about seeking employment and dealing with taxes. So it was libraries, not churches. And quite right too, our churches shouldn't try to compete with libraries for civic services, or book clubs for literary appreciation, or Rotary clubs for fellowship and community service, or choral societies for musical appreciation, or gyms and tramping clubs for healthy exercise. We cannot compete with such secular organisations. We should try to find inspiration in our faith to offer something very, very different. At that point, I'm going to pause for a break. And the two questions I'm going to leave you to have a think about as you stretch your legs is, why do you live in Auckland? But here's the other question. What is the sex and age of Auckland? Because after all, every city does have a sex and an age, according to John Berger, a British writer, who wrote 20 years ago a wonderful book called Keeping a Rendezvous. And he wrote, every city has a sex and an age which has nothing to do with demography. Rome is feminine, so is Odessa. London is a teenager and an urchin, and in this hasn't changed since the time of Dickens. Paris, I believe, is a man in his 20s in love with an older woman. So, 5 minutes to stretch your legs and consider why Auckland in this highly urbanised world, and what is Auckland's age and sex. And by way of stimulus, a few photos of Auckland will cycle through. Thanks. So what I'll do now is to go back to answer those 4 questions about God in the city. And I'll start in the question of God in the culture of a city. So let's begin with the individual, and again I'm going to return to Charles Landry from the Art of City Making. He says that lots of people experience a very human tension. Many tend to, quote, flip between seeking anchorage and wanting exploration, a yearning for completion, for being at one. And the tendency is certainly, that tension is certainly strongest in cities, where it's definitely compounded by proximity, lots of people living together, and also often a sense of ambition, which is what often brings people to cities. But if that duality is stifled, it can become very dangerous. So instead, if we can give it expression about being anchored but still exploring, and channel that into a sense of anchorage and a sense of freedom, then maybe that can become a power for good. The latter, the good, needs to bring together many arts. And Landry lists these as the arts of understanding human needs, wants and desires, the art of generating wealth and bending the dynamics of the markets and economics to the city's needs, and the art of circulation and city movement. Sounds like an advertisement for the Central Railway. But above all, here's a really interesting one, the art of trading power for creative influence, so the power of people is unleashed. So in other words, it's moving away from that very hierarchical city society to one that looked more like that new democracy I was identifying. Perhaps our faith is helpful in this, because our faith anchors us in our relationship with God, places us in a universal, even beyond a worldview, and yet perhaps many people experience that only as an anchor, only as a straitjacket that stifles any urge they have to explore. So likewise for them, the gospel imperatives are so demanding, so hard, that they doggedly, guiltily pursue lives they believe to be irredeemably flawed. So they get the anchor bit, but not the exploration. But we're redeemed by God's love. We are liberated by Christ's teaching. So they anchor us, but they set us free to explore, free to seek completion by and through our human relationships, free to create cultures in our cities that can help people fulfill their potential. There's an even bigger role for theology and faith, I believe, in the culture of our cities. And it's this: can the theology, the faiths of all the religions that we profess, come together in some way? Can they help us find, in our varied expressions, a greater understanding of God? Can they help us find a common ground and experience of God across our various faiths, and be able to relate to and engage with that? If it can, then it seems to me that our faith will contribute immeasurably to our urban lives, bringing peace, prosperity and deep fulfillment. Indeed, those sane oases that Mayer and Bryzak talk about. Yet, of course, history tells us the odds are stacked against us on this one. Overwhelmingly, religions divide, not unite, as we saw in Jerusalem. Religions make war, not love. And we've got an uphill battle there. So, yes to God on culture, but I would argue in a very multi-faith way. The next strand of the two is about God in society. So my question there was, can God help us empower people can help us achieve social justice? I'll deal first with the empowerment part of that, because I think that is the best way to, at least the way I see things, as a way of moving forward. In terms of empowerment, I worry a lot about lives repressed by religion, lives lived under the heavy yoke of temporal suffering in the hope of heavenly salvation. And such religions might achieve some kind of orderly, if rather fearful, society in our cities, but those will be pretty poor and dysfunctional cities, unable to meet the sort of challenges I talked about. We already know a lot about what social justice means, where it fails, and where we could put it right, but we don't. So what we need are lives released by religion, lives liberated by the sheer joy of God's abundance, lives made confident in our knowledge of the infinite possibilities that God gives us. This is one of those infinite possibilities. This is apparently in the United States, and so this is in some unknown Texas town where there is the equivalent of the Strawberry Fair, pretty much at the same time, November the 2nd, pretty much the same time, 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. And this is the Episcopal Church Annual Bazaar at Texas and 7th Streets. But out there on Highway 180 East is the Glad Tidings Church offering its own holiday bazaars. So I think this is all pretty cool that we have this great ecumenical upsurge of church bazaars. So in such a view of that empowerment, that would make it a great deal easier to deal with those issues of social justice and the like. The third question I posed around this was, can God help us restore our relationship with nature in our cities? Now, we often build very brutal cities. Their scale intimidates, their compartmentalization alienates, and their hardness discomforts. Crucially, they divorce us from nature. Hence, again, to re-quote Mumford, mind takes form in the city, and in turn, urban form conditions our mind. So brutal cities make for brutal people. But as I argued earlier, we need to build cities that begin to mimic nature in the way that they provide for their people in forms of energy, food, and indeed the use of all sorts of material. Cities that supply us with the genuine article in the form of bright sunlight, fresh air, clean rain, and then inspiration and recreation and relaxation and, dare I say, spiritual nourishment as well. We could learn how to build and enjoy such cities if we felt closer to nature, if we understood, honoured, and honoured our intimate dependency on nature. And cities can bring us close to nature, not though in the same way as a solitary tramp in a national park or on one of our great walks, but say marvelling at the lunch growing in your window box sill in your apartment, or the little wetland around the corner that helps recycle grey water whilst teeming with flora and fauna. There are a lot of important economic and ecological concepts here, not the least of which is making sure that everything we do replicates nature in that way. So this goes far beyond just kind of recycling newspapers and old cans. It's about reusing things down to parts per billion. Maybe the science is pretty cool. This was me in 2005 in Japan. I wish I could get that over for the Strawberry Fair next year. I think it caused quite a sensation. But far more importantly, are these concepts such as biomimicry, where we start to mimic nature in terms of the technology we use. There's some terrific biologists engaged in this work, such as Janine Benyus in the United States. One of the most arresting examples she uses, and we're not there yet, is that gram for gram, the thread of a spider is stronger than steel. But think how much energy we use to create a wire rope. We use huge energy to mine the coal and the iron ore to make the iron, and then even more energy to make the steel, and then to roll the steel and draw the wire. But a spider makes that, its material, in a cold biophysical process in its body. So how would we do that? How would we mimic nature so completely? And then the third question is, can God help us create economic equity along with that social justice? Any analysis of economic disasters, whether old ones such as the South Sea Bubble in England in 1721, and I'm going to talk more about the South Sea Bubble in a moment. This is Hogarth's great print about the merry-go-round that people were scrambling on to get shares into the South Sea Company, whilst they were being, those who fell off got hung, drawn and quartered and pilloried, and or trooped into the lottery. It's a very powerful social justice, social critique. But you see, this is very deeply embedded in human nature, whether it's the South Sea Bubble, it's the Great Depression, it's the global financial crisis. And rather marvellously, I discovered a couple of years ago that Harvard, in its business school, has a South Sea Bubble collection. And there's a wonderful quote here: "All the riches that we boast consists in scraps of paper." So you'd think that Harvard Business School might have learned something about all this, but in fact, there was an astonishingly large number of alumni involved in the global financial crisis, who apparently had learned nothing from the South Sea Bubble. They probably even weren't taught about it, including George W. Bush as president. And so I'm afraid there's not much hope there. When we think about that in a New Zealand context, about what's gone on here over the years, this is a wonderful Garth Tapper drawing of people on the stock exchange back in the 1980s. And then this is another artwork based loosely on newspaper hoardings going back to 1987, which I absolutely love. So how might we respond to that? The absolute heart of this is ethics underpin wise behaviour. Now, just secular ethics can do a relatively decent job, and there are some simple guides. Actually, there's one thing, demystify the ethical writings of Aristotle, examine controversial aspects of ethical thought. Over here, discover how to apply ancient wisdom in your everyday life. Or you can get the 2-for-1 book, which is really cool. But that's not going to be enough. Secular ethics get us a reasonable way in that, on that journey, but I believe it's only when we find God and our Christian faith underpinning that, or indeed other faiths too, do they start to begin to have a far greater power. Now I'm going to do two last things. First of all, give an example of a really horrendous city of God. And this is as portrayed in the terrific film from 2002, Brazilian film. It was about life in one of the favelas, which was incredibly brutal and deeply damaging, although there was some love and sex in it as well. In contrast to that, I'll offer you one example. When Lynn and I were on our way back from our pilgrimage to Santiago, we paused briefly in Spain, in Barcelona, to visit Gaudi's extraordinary masterpiece of cathedral, Sagrada Familia. It radiates extraordinary power in its living stone, its light, physical and spiritual, its deeply moving storytelling of God and humans, expressed in this extraordinary sculptural facades, and its reimagining of what a huge church means, and the extraordinary energy of the throngs of people there, and the enormous inspiration of it. And I'm afraid this minor selection of photos I took don't do justice to it at all. But how might we find God in our city here in Auckland? And as I mentioned, a young member of the congregation did have that view on the age and sex of Auckland, and I'm going to offer another one. This is perhaps me being slightly romantic, but I reckon that Auckland is a man in his 60s. No, this isn't about me. This other man is rather world-weary, disappointed that he's much nearer the end of his life than the beginning. A city man, one of billions on the planet, numbed and scarred by urban life. But, however, there is hope for this particular man because he lives here in Auckland and he is in love with a younger woman. So this is not about me. And this younger woman is Tamaki Makoro. And she derives her name from the Māori for Auckland, often translates as, of course, Tamaki's easy, that's isthmus. Of an isthmus of 1,000 lovers, but the mako is rather more tricky to translate. It's usually translated as lovers, but it can also translate as favourite or spouse, implying a highly sought target of admiration. So I think that something around that. But it's a reference to the extraordinary fertile volcanic soil here in Auckland, the extraordinary light, the harbours, the beaches, the bush, and the rich sea as well. Yet we could do an awful lot more. We could create here and give to the world a very different kind of urban life if we work with this great God-given abundance and apply those 4 principles of sustainable faith, if you like, around culture, society, and nature and the economy. And here's one very small way we can do it. In a sense, we can do like the early Christians did and co-opt other people's festivals. In this case, it's Matariki. And this is how I describe it in a paper that the Royal Commission on Auckland Governance hired me to write in 2008, and the task I was set was to try to describe Auckland in 2060. I'll be 110 then, so I've kind of scaled this back to around about 2040, but I'll only be 90. But 2040 is going to be a great year. It's the bicentenary of our country, Treaty of Waitangi, but it's also the bicentenary of Auckland. So Treaty of Waitangi, February the 6th, 2040, bicentenary of Auckland, September 19th. This is what I wrote. One of the most popular of the festivals is the Water Fire Festival of Matariki. We borrowed the idea 50 years or so ago from Providence, Rhode Island in the United States, but we've made it our own. On the longest night of the year, 7 huge floating fire sculptures representing the 7 stars of Matariki Pleiades are anchored 100 metres or so off the waterfront. From sunset to past midnight, black-clad performers in torch-lit boats quietly tend the fires while music from around the world plays along the waterfront. Despite it being a long and usually chill evening, many hardy souls linger in cafes, bars and parks until about half an hour before dawn. Then they gaze at the northeast horizon, watching Matariki rise. It's such a wonderfully contemplative, hopeful time of year of new plantings, of new beginning. I didn't say this in the Royal Commission report, but what underpins that for me as I wrote it is that God is everywhere in our city, among us and our neighbours. All we need to do, and this is actually very hard, is to reach out to each other. Thank you.